Welcome to another edition of Crack with Crack Willow. My name is Greg Howes, author and redsmith. Today, my guest is Garry Shaw, author and Egyptologist. Good afternoon.
Hello, it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me on the show.
My pleasure. What's it like where you are today?
It's not bad, actually. It's been a little bit grey this morning, a little bit bluer now. I'm in Lille. I'm in France. I live in France.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm in the north. Yeah, the cold part, the rainy part, but the friendliest part, apparently, so everybody tells me. And in my experience, too, everybody around here is very, very nice. So, yeah, it's a great place to live. And today the weather is quite nice, too, with that little bit of October chill. So
Yeah, well, it's milky here in southwest Wales. Not cold, but milky. At least it's not raining.
Yeah, same here. Not raining here. It rains a lot in Lille. That is the only downside to this city, but today is quite nice, actually.
Good. Right, a big leading question to start us off. When did your love of ancient Egypt begin?
Well, I think people like me tend to fall in love with it as a child. So I can't remember a time where I wasn't interested in ancient Egypt. I mean, I studied it at school, so I think this was primary school where we all had to make pyramids and mummify little clothes pegs and put inside the pyramid and things like
Wow.
that. So I vividly remember this. I still have some hieroglyphs I drew at that point as well in the class, sitting around somewhere at my mum's house. So clearly, these things were important enough for me to keep these mementos over the years. I didn't throw away these Egyptian-themed things like I did with many of the other notes I took from primary school. And basically, after that, it just carried on. I was a child of the '80s, so Indiana Jones was a big thing for me.
Yeah.
Heading into the '90s, we had Stargate. And in
Hmm.
general, I loved archaeology. My parents would often take me on trips to see archaeological sites around the UK or when we were on holiday, castles as well, things like this. So I had a general love of history. Egypt, for some reason, though, seemed to grip me more than others, and I can't say for certain why. It's like many people. The pyramids are fascinating, mummies are fascinating, hieroglyphs are mysterious and lovely, and I wanted to learn how to read them.
Mm.
And so I think there was part of me that just wanted to learn more about all of this as I was growing up. I started buying books on the topic. I remember vividly going to the museum in Liverpool with my brother. My brother-in-law used to take me to visit lectures as well, so I'd get to listen to speakers and sometimes buy their books. So it was all the way there at the beginning, and then and this is as a teenager, and so I
Mm.
decided to study this at study archaeology at university. And I kind of basically specialized in Egypt and went from there, doing a MA in Egyptology and a PhD in Egyptology too. So it's kind of just been always around in my life. And yeah, but I can't pinpoint an exact moment, you know, where I thought this is why this is something I want to research more. This is fascinating. It's
Mm.
always kind of been there in the back of my head, I think, and
It,
then
it
eventually
is.
it became
It
my
is.
life.
It is totally fascinating. I mean, I can remember being taken, apparently on my own request, in 1972 to the Tutankhamun exhibition in London,
Right? Yeah.
and that was. I mean, so I was interested even then. So that was 4 hours queuing to get in. Then, by the way. But I it didn't seem to trouble me, and but like I say, I can never remember when I haven't been interested in it. Really, it's just such a wide length of time as well, isn't it? It's just
Yeah.
extremely exotic, colourful, mysterious. The list goes on, really.
Yeah, and I think it's everybody at some degree has an understanding of ancient Egypt, even if they never read a book on it or have much of an interest in it. It's kind of always there in pop culture, in movies, in the
Definitely.
background. It's always there in museums, obviously, and I think people have a sort of knowledge of Egypt as an ancient culture and Egyptian religion, more so than probably other ancient cultures, let's say in general. People will know the god Osiris. At least
Yeah.
they'll know the word. People know King Tutankhamun. They've heard Ramesses,
Hmm.
Cleopatra, people like this. But you maybe go to some other ancient cultures, they might have not the same level of familiarity. And I think this is because it's been such a part of culture, all the way through history. the ancient Romans, the ancient Greeks are just as fascinated with ancient Egypt, which to them
Yes.
was already ancient, as we are today. Even though we lost the ability to read hieroglyphs for a long period, um, you know, uh, information about ancient Egypt was passed along through the Greeks and the Romans, and so it never really left, completely from our cultural sphere, from our understanding of history and mythology and world religions. And in fact, it kind of went through waves of becoming more prominent in different periods. For example, in the Renaissance, you got
Hmm.
people searching for the earliest language. They want to understand the language of God, and so they start looking at ancient languages, looking at Hebrew, and also looking at hieroglyphics. And of course, they couldn't read hieroglyphics at this point, so there were attempts to understand it, and people writing about this topic. But because of this interest, though, in trying to understand the origins of Christianity, the origins of the language of God, and the language that he used to speak creation,
Hmm.
it led people in this direction of Egypt. And so there was this interest in the Renaissance period, and this then had another wave of explosion of interest when Champollion deciphered hieroglyphics.
Hmm.
So there was Egyptomania then in the 19th century, and then it happened again with the Tutankhamun tomb discovery in the 20th century. And so this keeps being renewed for a kind of new generation,
Yeah,
a new era.
because you had all the Art Deco stuff, which of course was heavily influenced by the new finds in Egypt.
Yeah.
And also it's interesting that the old fairground rides, they really leapt on board with it as well. When you look at the old hand painted stuff from the 30s and 40s, it was something that they thought that it was an interest that was transferable to what they were trying to create, really, an atmosphere.
Hmm. Hmm.
So
Yeah.
when we talk about ancient Egypt, we are talking about an extremely long period of time. In fact, over 3,000 years. Um, do you have a favourite period in that time, or why, or is it just the whole?
So, I mean, I'm interested in the whole,
Mhm.
but I suppose if I had to pick, I mean, it would be the New Kingdom, which
Okay.
is this era from about 1500 BC to about 1200 BC. And the reason I'm saying this is because it was the period that my PhD was on.
Okay.
So it's probably the time I know the best, particularly the
Hmm.
18th dynasty, which is a phase of the New Kingdom. The first phase, the 18th dynasty, the 19th dynasty, the 20th dynasty are all different ruling lines across the New Kingdom.
Hmm.
And so I studied the 18th dynasty kings and their courts, and the people looking around at this time. And I was looking at royal authority, how we can understand royal authority in this time period, and if we can really say anything about it at all, historically, or if it's all just effectively propaganda or the information we have. To explain that a little better, my idea though was to look at this one of the best evidence periods of ancient Egyptian history, at the most best evidenced person, the
Yeah.
king, and try to understand, using the historical texts that survived, can we really say much about his personality, about individual decision making? Because it's
Hmm.
so much covered up by this kind of veneer of official presentation. And so I spent a lot of time translating the text from this time, particularly royal commands and decrees, and trying to look for aspects that might be reflective of the individual's personality, the king's personality, or if he was being influenced by the court, and so forth. And this, so that was what I did for a few years,
Hmm.
studying this period, and it kind of, yeah, it led me to, well, publish in the end my first book for the general public, which was called The Pharaoh. And so this was about me trying to present the pharaoh as an individual, not just as a
Hmm.
sort of symbol of ancient Egypt, but as an individual who had a life and family and a job to do and things like this.
Yeah.
So it was really interesting.
So, move it. I mean, yeah, there does seem to be an awful lot of. There's obviously, the further we go on in ancient Egypt, the more sort of evidence we have. But going back to sort of like one of the earliest times in the Old Kingdom, what do you think inspired the pyramids, and in particular its shape or their shape?
Yeah, it's a complex one to answer, I suppose, because
I thought it might be.
yeah, that's right. So I mean, I'm not going to, I think, solve this one right now, but
Okay.
I can give you some ideas. So
Okay.
basically, I mean, if you look at the technology available to people in the ancient world, if you want to build something tall and impressive, the pyramid shape is your only real option to create something stable. And so it's why you see a lot of cultures across the world, building in this kind of pyramidal shape, because it just makes sense from an
Hmm.
architectural point of view. So that's one angle. That's the more practical way, I'd say, of looking at it. But there's also this angle of the symbolic meaning behind this. And
Hmm.
so, you know, was this lucky? Did they have this idea in their minds of this pyramid shape and how its meaning to them, and it just so happened to be the best way to build a structure this way that would survive? Or did the meaning come afterwards, or did it come at the same time? And in fact, if you look at the evolution of pyramids, all the way back to the earliest royal burials and how the pyramids evolved over the time afterwards, you
Hmm.
can kind of see that they were still experimenting with different ideas surrounding this pyramid shape. And so the answer is probably more complex simply because it might have changed to the Egyptians over these years too, or become multi-leveled. So if you go back to, let's say, it's about 3000 BC, 3100 BC, you get the earliest royal burials from the first and the second dynasties. At the very beginning, when Egypt had just formed as a state,
Yep.
these are a place called Abydos and Saqqara. These are burials in the ground, dug up, big pits in some cases, tunneling in other cases, but they all seem to have had a marker on top of them, and this hasn't survived. So we can only have some ideas a little about how these original markers on top of the burial spaces for kings originally appeared, but it looks a bit like a mound, we think.
Yep.
Potentially two mounds interconnected. And so from the very beginning, you had this idea of marking a royal burial with a mound shape. And is that connected with Egyptian creation ideas?
Well, I was going to say that is it the mound of creation, which
Hmm.
is often one of their creation myths.
Yeah, exactly. And so, for those listeners who don't know, the creation myths often involve the chaotic waters of Noon, which is this kind of endless ocean. And the first land, the first mound,
Hmm.
emerges from this endless waters and basically is the first mound of creation. And so, this is as associated with resurrection, with kind of the appearance of this kind of new beginning, the beginning of time. And so it's a good symbolic thing to have on a royal grave, this idea of resurrection, rebirth, and the afterlife, and so forth. And so that probably is the beginning of all of this.
Mm.
The
Like a
first step.
universal womb tomb, almost.
Well, I mean, there is this rebirth going on. So
Yeah.
certainly this rebirth among the stars. And you get this a bit later on in the pyramid texts, which are, centuries after the time I'm talking about now. But you have this idea of the king being launched up as if being born into the sky,
Yeah.
among the stars anew. But at this point, we don't really know. We don't have textual sources, right, for this very early phase. We have
Mhm.
like the odd hieroglyphs knocking around. There's a little bit of administration, but we don't have long religious texts being written at this point. And so to understand what's in their minds is quite difficult because you're always projecting backwards
Yeah.
from later evidence. But what we do see is that this becomes a bit of a thing, that, you have these markers being located above the royal burial and then also above the burials of courtiers too. They call them mastabas, these kind of flat brick
Yes.
markers that you put on top of your burial if you have enough money.
Hmm.
Um, and then you get this change where they decided to start building upwards. And you see this doesn't seem to have been like an idea of building a pyramid immediately. And so the first time we see this is in a royal burial is with the pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara, the first king of the third dynasty, an old kingdom king. And what we know from looking at this building architecturally, from there are cracks and breaks in the building, so you can see a bit of this structure within. You can see that there were multiple periods of building,
Yeah.
and in fact, it seems to reflect multiple periods of changing the idea of what they want. So that the first stage of this royal burial does seem to be again this kind of flat uh, brick construction above the royal tomb shaft that goes into the ground. Then someone decided to extend it, and then they extended it again a little bit, and this is all going to the side. And then they built a few steps up. And so this is really the point when someone clearly thought we need to build this upwards, and you start
Yeah.
getting this kind of pyramid shape. And then they expanded it again and added a few extra steps. And so there were multiple stages where you can see maybe there was an evolution of thought going on. This idea of having a step pyramid. You're building it in steps again. This makes architectural sense. They
Hmm.
don't quite know what they're doing at this point with stone construction. This is all very new to them. And you can see that they're experimenting and trying to figure out how to best use this material. Um, and so basically, what is this meaning to them at the time? The question then becomes, what does this mean to Joseph? or to at least the
Yeah.
architects at that moment.
Hmm.
Is it the same idea of the mound of creation? Maybe, possibly, very possibly so. But we know, again, projecting backwards from later texts, in the pyramid texts, we have references to a sort of stairway to heaven, that the king
Yeah.
could ascend these steps to the stars. And
Hmm.
so perhaps it being steps is not simply just an architectural way of making this easier for them. It was perhaps also a way of moving the king symbolically towards the stars again.
Hmm.
So again, now you've got the mound of creation idea. You might have a sort of steps to the stars element built into it. And this then continues for the rest of the Third Dynasty, this idea of having um, a stepped pyramid, although none of the others are completed. Um, and then the final stage then comes in the Fourth Dynasty when we get true pyramids. These, ones that have the
Yes.
perfect flat sides where they've
Hmm.
carefully cased them in this Tura limestone, which would have gleamed
Hmm.
white in the sunlight. So you have these true pyramids, smooth-sided ones. And this again coincides with some other changes that we get hints at again, because again, we have very limited written textual sources from this time, although we have more and more being found. You might have heard about these papyri they discovered relatively recently, where it talks about materials being shipped and transported to the pyramid project of
Yes.
Khufu,
Yeah.
all of this. So these, we have bits of information about all of this. Um, but again, at this point, they're no longer step pyramids. They're smooth-sided. So is this a change in the symbolism? And what we do see under the Fourth Dynasty is a growing importance of the sun god, and the inclusion, for example, of the word Ra in kings'
Yeah.
names.
Hmm.
The sudden appearance of the title Son of Ra before the king's name. And so perhaps these smooth-sided pyramids have more of a solar symbolism. Perhaps people have argued that they might be the sun's rays kind of frozen in
Hmm.
stone, as if the rays are coming down from the sun above. So you have more of a solar symbolism here. So
Hmm.
by this point, all of these ideas could probably have been believed at the same time. The Egyptians very much like to hold on to ideas. They didn't get rid of things.
Yes.
Um, so yes, they like to list, and so you would never discard an idea in case it was right and it might be useful to you. So I can't. I'm sorry. I can believe the idea that all of these ideas were simultaneous for the
Yep.
Egyptians as time progressed.
Hmm.
And then you get the pyramid texts later on, which talk about the whole journey of the introduction of Osiris in our written
Hmm.
sources, Isis, and the myth of Osiris, and all these wonderful things. The first evidence for this is in the Fifth Dynasty, so a little bit into the beginning of Egyptian history.
Hmm.
The question is, did they already believe in these deities beforehand? If they did, we don't have evidence for it, unfortunately.
Because the Egyptians were definitely traditionalists at heart, weren't they?
Yes, that's
But
right.
they
Yeah.
did change over a very long period of time. But in their heart of hearts, I think that they were always traditionalists.
I think so. Yeah, I mean, there is this conception of Egypt as being quite unchanging, which I know, as you've studied ancient Egypt yourself, you know that actually there is quite a lot of change over time. Things
Hmm.
do, art does evolve. The
Yes.
style of rule does change. Even the jewelry and things like this. The burial way, the styles of burial. They don't have pyramids all the way through. For example, we have the Valley of the Kings later on. So
Hmm.
there are all these changes, but at the same time, there is this level of traditionalism. This idea that you shouldn't discard ideas from the past, you just add to them, and they all exist at the same time. This is very important because of the concept of Mart, this idea
Yes.
of balance.
Yes. Would you like to explain to the listeners what Mart means, and also, do you think it was an aspiration for the common folk as much as it was for the pharaohs in their own sort of daily lives?
Yeah, no problem.
That's
So
an easy question, isn't
yeah,
it?
I know. Yeah, you keep throwing me these really easy ones. I mean, where does pyramids come from? Yeah,
Yeah,
what is
yeah,
This
I
is
thought so.
all the easy questions.
Okay.
So yeah, but I can answer it. I think. So Mart it's a fundamental concept in ancient Egyptian thought. It is a concept and also a goddess.
Mhm.
So like many things in ancient Egypt, ideas are personified, forces are personified. So you have Mart as a goddess, but what I'm talking about now is Mart as a concept. Ma'at is this very fundamental idea to the Egyptians of balance, correct balance, justice, order, everything that is correctly balanced in the cosmos. Um, and so there's this idea that the king and the gods are working together for the good of the cosmos. The gods do their jobs. Gods have responsibilities. They have
Yeah.
jobs in the universe to do, and they're part of this process of ensuring balance in the cosmos. And the king has this role too of dealing with the gods to ensure they're happy and on the side of Egypt, and that helps create balance as well in Egypt. And the king has a job also to keep balance in society itself. So one of his major jobs is to keep Ma'at for Egypt and the world. And so this is all about this idea of making sure that chaos or disorder does not overcome order. It's kind
Yeah.
of basically an idea of middle way, the kind of keeping things central in the sense that you don't want to be too chaotic, but you also don't want to be too ordered. And I think that's one of the interesting things here. There's always this kind of mixing of the two. You can have too much order and then chaos dissipates a bit, and then chaos is always fighting back and might overtake order at some point. And to the Egyptians, the idea wasn't that you want order to destroy chaos. You don't want to get rid of it completely because chaos is a part of the universe. It's an
Hmm.
accepted part of the way the cosmos operates. And you might be able to defeat it. And it's personified normally by this chaos snake called Apophis, which is out to destroy the sun every single day. And even if the
Yes.
Egyptians killed this chaos snake, it always comes back. So it's the same way with the idea of chaos. You can order everything you want around you. You can make your office, let's say, in a perfect state of order. Everything in its right place, everything put away. But chaos is going to creep back. Things will get misplaced. You will lose something. There will be that pile of papers in the corner. So chaos is always threatening to return. And so the Egyptians had this idea that you don't want to eradicate it. You just need to keep things balanced. You got to keep it mati, kind of
Mm-hmm.
this kind of middle way. And so this is the importance of this in a cosmic way. And this adds to this, so refers back to what I was saying earlier about this traditionalism you find. Because if this is your outlook, you don't want to keep things, by adding something new, by changing things, you
Yeah.
add an element of chaos.
Yes.
And so you want to keep things ordered, and you keep things ordered by repetition, by doing things the way they've always been done, by following the same rituals, by doing art in a similar way, although it does change, it's roughly similar. And so you keep this going, and the rituals are important, the art is important, the statues are important, that they all have a certain unchanging quality, even if they are tweaked over the years and adapt to the times. You've got a little bit of chaos, but not too much being introduced when you make changes. And this is fundamental in the way that you look at everything from ancient Egypt that survives, in fact, because I mean it influences the written sources we have, which are often official sources from temples, let's say, or sacred spaces like tombs. You've got to remember that everything that's written in there is according to Ma'at. They
Yes.
don't want to introduce chaos into these sacred spaces, and so they have this kind of level of, let's say, control over the information provided to stop it
Hmm.
introducing this. Because the Egyptians also believed in magic and the power of magic. And if you wrote something down, hieroglyphs are sacred writings, they have a power.
Yes.
And so if you wrote something down in a tomb that was chaotic or dangerous or bad, this could bring this to you in the afterlife. It could affect the gods. It could have a cosmic impact. And so this impacts us as historians because let's say you're studying a war, a military campaign.
Hmm.
Well, they've all been smoothed to some degree according to Mart, and it can be interpreted as propaganda, but at the same time, these things were only often seen by the gods. These
Yep.
war scenes that you have inside a temple, very few people would see it, and the lighting would have made it so dim that you probably wouldn't be able to see it anyway. Um, and so these things are for the gods' eyes, and they're in sacred locations, and so they're presented in a way that won't disturb the order. And
Hmm.
so they always follow a similar order. If you to give it quickly, the elements of this, for example, you would have someone telling the king that an enemy has done something bad. They've invaded Egyptian territory or causing rebellious chaos or something. The king then goes to the gods. He gets a sanction to go and fight. He fights them. He wins. The king does this alone because he protects the Egyptians. So the king
Yep.
is the only person who's allowed to kill enemies. And then he returns, brings treasure and loot and prisoners and slaves, offers them to the gods, and order is restored. So you have this sequence. of
Hmm.
chaos. King sets out to fix things, order is restored. And so this is the same thing we find again and again and again across Egyptian sources. And so it's sometimes hard to understand what is the reality of what actually
True.
happened
Yeah.
because of this.
It's an idealized account often, isn't it?
Hmm. And it's an idealized account that follows certain rules of presentation.
Yeah.
And so you've got to understand these rules of presentation and try your best to try and strip them away to some degree to get at what might have been the reality. And so we use archaeology for that and other sources and try and piece it all together. And that's what makes it exciting and fun to try and reconstruct the
Mm.
history here. Um, now, for ordinary people, though, there's the element here of how much would Mart have been part of their lives as
Mm.
well. Now, remember again, the other problem we have here is that much of this comes from the elite. We're often looking at
Yes.
the elite view of the world, the way that the king saw the world or the cosmos, the world view of the elite and his nobles. So, a very tiny percentage of the population. Um, Now, as far as the ordinary person goes, we don't really know much about the beliefs. How what they believed in a daily basis about the cosmos and about Mart and so forth. I suppose we can probably guess that there would have been, it would have been very similar to some degree. These ideas transfer, move down through, this like. I'm trying to think of the best way to explain that, but
Well,
for
they had
example,
amulets as well, didn't they? They had amulets, which I suppose was their way of warding off chaos or bad influences.
sure, sure, yeah. So amulets that will have shown protective gods, and so that gives an insight into the types of gods that were important to ordinary people. Um, we know that in most households, for example, there were symbols of deities as well, but these were often not the ones that we typically associate with Egypt. They will have gods of the household. These are
Yes.
the gods that were more important to the average person. Gods like Bes, for example, this kind of dwarf-like leonine character with a scary
Yeah.
face and a big beard, and
Hmm.
he scares away demonic forces with his own frightening appearance and the noise he makes and so forth. Sometimes he has musical instruments, sometimes he has weapons. He's meant to scare away demonic forces from the household and protect particularly children and mothers during childbirth. These are the gods that are important at home. Renenutet, a goddess of the harvest. Most people in Egypt were farmers. And
Yeah.
so God's connected with childbirth, God's connected with fields, fertility. These were the ones that were mainly important. Whereas if you think of gods like Amun, so Amun Ra, the great god, the king of the gods, and this type of thing, these were the
Yes.
types of people dealt with by technicians, like experts, engineers, and specialists. I want to say, in the temples, people we translate as priests, but more literally in ancient Egyptian were God's servants treating the god like a servant to a king. But I tend to think of them, as I say, as like technicians. They're trained in this kind of very technical job of the rituals,
Yeah.
keeping the god happy, keeping the machine of Mart operating in the
Yes.
temples for the good of the cosmos.
I
Um,
mean, the gods have always sort of fascinated me right the way back since my first interest, really, and particularly ones such as Bast, Ptah, Thoth, Anubis, Isis, and Osiris. Um,
yeah,
do you think that some of the so-called darker deities, such as Set and Sekhmet, were always dark or evil overtones, or or were they made that way by political or geographical power shifts?
yeah. I mean, I guess this actually connects back with what we were just saying, I suppose, about the importance of things that balance in the Egyptian conception of the world. So, yes, I think Seth in particular has a very bad rap these days,
Yeah.
and this started, you could say, in the late periods of Egyptian history when, he started being seen as this sort of more demonic force in the world. But I think if you went further back in time, you would see that to the ancient Egyptians, before the late period, Seth was an important part of the cosmos. Again, I talk about chaos being an important part. Well, Seth or Set is this god who's connected with aggression,
Mhm.
with dangerous forces, with the desert, with like storms, um, and so the kind of more aggressive, dangerous things that you encounter. But again, just as diplomacy and friendliness is an important characteristic to the ancient Egyptians, this aggression could also be used for positive reasons too, if the need arose. And so, this kind of force of power, this aggressive energy that Seth embodied, could be used by the king. For example, when
Hmm.
he's going to war, the king might, invoke Seth when going into battle. And so he has a positive influence there. It's not the sort of like demonic evil force in the world. He's using this aggression, this god. And so he's an important part of the cosmos. Seth had a role in protecting the sun god on his daily journey when the sun was being attacked by this chaos snake.
That's right. Hmm.
So he had a positive role to play in society, in the cosmos, and so this is why he's always an important part of the Egyptian pantheon. But it's later on in Egyptian history, because of this connection with him, murdering Osiris and so forth, he became
Hmm.
increasingly demonized over the centuries, and is practically a demonic figure, basically, by the end of Egyptian history. But it wasn't always the case. And you mentioned, I think you mentioned, did you mention Sekhmet just then? Uh,
Yes.
Question.
Yes.
Yeah. So Sekhmet too has this kind of dual characteristic. I mean, Sekhmet is a lioness, a goddess with this fiery aspect to her, where she burns enemies and destroys them, which she uses as a protective feature normally.
Hmm.
So she burns the enemies of the sun god through her fire. She is an aspect of the Eye of Ra, like many goddesses. Many goddesses are associated with the Eye of Ra and the flaming
Yes.
power that could come and destroy enemies. And this is simply, we think, because the Egyptian word for eye is iret, and this is a feminine word. So all things connected with the eye are feminine. So you have goddesses performing this role. And so Sekhmet has this very important role in protecting the king, protecting the sun god. But she is also connected with disease, plague.
Hmm.
It's the arrows of Sekhmet that cause plague and disease and can make you sick. And so she's a very dangerous force as well. But at the same time, doctors were priests of Sekhmet. If you wanted to get better from an illness, you called on one of them, and they might give you an amulet of Sekhmet, and you'd wear the amulet of this goddess, because the same force that can create this dangerous energy can repel it as well. And
Yes.
so you have this kind of idea of the magic here being a protective force by invoking the goddess who created it.
Hmm.
So she
And she
again, she
was,
has
of
this dual
course,
aspect.
the sort of consort of Ptah as well, wasn't she? In some, well, sometimes it's Bast and sometimes it's Sekhmet, but those two do seem to oscillate around a little bit in
Yes.
Egyptian
Well,
history, to
I
say the
mean,
least.
it's not unusual. We get to like different family groupings at different times and in different places. So yes, we do find these changes, and Egyptian religion is very what's the word I could use? Changeable? No, that's not the right word. Adaptable. I think is it changes depending on the location and the needs
Yeah,
of the local.
location is a big thing, isn't it? Because they obviously grew, these deities grew largely from sort of um, localized, distinct areas before
Hmm.
they sort of became amalgamated into the whole, so to speak.
Yeah, there's a very distinct, local aspect to the gods, which again was retained pretty much throughout Egyptian history. We get myths kind of feeding each other, so certain myths about one god in one part of Egypt might then be applied to a different god somewhere else in Egypt. But nobody seemed to really be concerned about this. I think they just simply accepted that these forces around them, all played a role in these myths and stories, and or you call this god this, well, we have a goddess that does that same thing. So they're all kind of connected as these kind of forces around us. But yes, this stayed throughout Egyptian history, that you had your local temple, and the temple had your local family of gods, and so you would worship them in that location. But on a cosmic level, these certain gods might have other roles to play and responsibilities beyond your local town or local district. So cosmic roles to play as well. So yeah, they have multiple roles, multiple responsibilities, but also very local responsibilities, where you might just be, this god might be your local deity in your temple, who
Hmm.
you might be offering to try and help you in your daily life.
Do you think that any of them may have been actually based, such as, let's say, Osiris for that matter, were actually based on real people, perhaps in prehistory?
I don't think so. Personally, at least I
Hmm.
don't think so. I think the beginnings of these are more in the idea of forces. That there are forces around us, and the Egyptians trying to explain the cosmos around them, the world around them. The Egyptians were very, very interested in explaining things. very observant, very interested in trying to say, why does this happen? Why is this particular rock formation here? Why is this mound over here? You know,
They're very animistic in
yeah,
their,
yeah,
certainly in their, when it began, and even
sure.
so later on as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, and I think this is the beginning of it, right? So you have these forces, and then you start giving them, personifying them as time goes by. You give them personalities and more characteristics, because I think many of the Egyptian gods, the personalities don't really shine through too strongly in many of the myths, particularly the ancient ones. They get a bit more personality when you see the Greek and Romans talking about them, when they kind of add the Greco-Roman spin to them. But earlier on, many of the myths are quite straightforward in their use of the gods and goddesses and using them to explain things. As I say, why is this temple here? Well, let's talk about our local creation myth. Why is
Yeah.
this rock this color? Well, it's the blood of this goddess. Why is the sun? Why does the sun move across the sky? Okay, well, that must be the sun god on his journey on his boat, because the sky is blue, water is blue. This must be a giant waterway above us that the sun is sailing on, and around us, surrounding the world, is this giant endless ocean. So using these concepts to explain everything, and so if we're surrounded by water, this endless ocean which they call noon, then basically all water that enters our world is a manifestation of this noon.
Mm.
Um, and
It's
so you had,
interesting you mentioned colour there, because it's always interested me. I mean, Egyptian art is visually exuberant and rich in colour.
mm,
And would it be fair to say that colour had a language and a potency all of its own?
yeah, I mean the colors that you see normally have a symbolic meaning. I mean, the one that you'll see all over the place is, of course, gold, yellow. And I think this was probably one of the most important of the colors because it represents eternity.
Hmm.
Gold was believed to last forever. Gold is the skin of the gods, so it represents their eternal nature as well. And so it's no surprise then when you see, for example, Tutankhamun's death mask, that he has golden skin, because
Yeah.
this is not just a beautiful use of this very precious material, it's the skin of the gods. He has become a god in death. And so there's all these interconnected elements that are connected around this color of this material. But then other important colors too. For example, black was associated with the fertile soil.
Hmm.
This very important soil that is replenished every year by the flood, and therefore is what really gives life to ancient Egypt and the world. And so you see black being associated with the god Osiris, because of the regenerative quality that he represents. Because in the end, people associate him generally with the afterlife, but he's mainly a god of regeneration.
Yes.
So. Um, I mean, similarly, green as well. So the green that you see in the fields that comes back every year is also this kind of aspect of fertility, regeneration again. And so again, you can also sometimes see Osiris with green skin because of this.
Yes.
Red is a dangerous color. Red is the color that you associate normally with the desert. But again, it has a repellent, protective quality too. So we know that sometimes people would paint their doors red as a way of repelling dangerous forces from the household.
I didn't know that. No, I've never read that. That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. People get the impression that ancient Egyptians worshipped animal deities, but they didn't really, did they?
No, I mean it's a common misconception because of animals are such a prominent part of Egyptian religion, particularly in the way that gods and goddesses are shown. But it's not the animals themselves that were being worshipped by the Egyptians. It's kind of the gods can be shown in animal forms, um, but this is normally reflects an aspect of their responsibility in the cosmos, or one of their major roles. It doesn't mean that the Egyptians actually envisioned these beings as being animal headed, and so I think that's an important thing here too.
Hmm.
If an Egyptian was imagining meeting the god Horus, I don't think this Egyptian would think that he would meet a literally falcon headed person.
No.
This is just a way of representing this kind of divine force in a way that humans can interact with. And normally, if you see a god with a hawk's head, they have a sort of cosmic role because they're in the sky.
Yes.
And so they have an element that's connected with sort of like the sky on the cosmos in general. If a jackal-headed god might have something more to do with the afterlife, because of the desert routes that lead through all of that. A lioness is normally connected with like a ferociousness of that type of animal, and so it represents a certain quality or something that reminded the Egyptians of the quality of this deity. Now, also we have, of course, animal mummies that were produced in huge quantities, particularly in the later phases of Egyptian history when this became very popular, where temples would be breeding animals close to cats in
Particularly, yes.
particular. Yeah, millions of cats, dogs, every animal that you can think of that's connected with the Egyptian deities. They would be breeding them, and unfortunately for the animals, killing them for as a sort of way of providing pilgrims with an offering to give to the gods. So if you were visiting a temple, you could go to let's say a booth, a stall nearby, and you could purchase a mummified cat. If this was, let's say, the Temple of Bastet, let's say in
Yeah.
Bubastis, in the north. And this would be something that you would then offer, you would give to the temple as a sort of physical prayer, a votive offering, right? So this is why they were produced in such numbers. These would then be placed in the catacombs or buried in the area, and this would be left there eternally then as an offering to this god by this individual. So you have lots and lots and lots of these preserved, left over from this period. But yeah, the priests, the temple staff would be breeding these animals specifically for this purpose. It's not like you would mummify, your pet or something like this.
No.
You would buy this as a transaction with the temple.
Yes, I mean, and Bast really, which she's always fascinated me. I mean, it's particularly because how she sort of like rose from virtual obscurity to becoming almost a sort of state deity, and like you say, spurring on to breed thousands and thousands of cats. Could you explain a little bit more about her evolution and her multiple depictions throughout the period, the
Yeah,
long period?
no worries. Yeah, Bastet is an interesting one. Bast or Bastet. She is one of actually the earliest goddesses we know of, which I guess might surprise some people because I know again people tend to know about Amun, Osiris, Isis, but
Mm,
Bastet or all information about Bastet actually predates those other more famous gods to us. She's one of the earliest ones that we have any evidence for at all, and she's found, for example, on inscriptions from the Fourth Dynasty. I think even going back to about 2700 BC is probably the earliest one. But in the beginning, the earliest phases, she's generally shown as a sort of fierce lioness, the same way that we would see Sekhmet as well.
yeah.
So they're both quite similar at this time in their role. Um, I think there's only one example, in fact, throughout all of Egyptian history of her being shown as a human. So generally, she's shown as a lioness or as a cat later on. Um, she has this major association with the city of Bubastis, which is in the delta, so in the north of Egypt. And although she has a role throughout Egyptian history, as you say, she's not absolutely prominent. She is a protector of the king, like many goddesses are, who have this kind of role of being protective. But it's really only in what we call the third intermediate period that we get her rising to prominence. And
Mhm.
this was a period reasonably late in Egyptian history, let's say from about 1000 BC, after that slightly. Because we have a period now in that phase when there's lots of different ruling dynasties competing for power. And it just so happens that one of these ruling dynasties comes from Bubastis. And so when you have someone important like that coming from one of these towns, they tend to raise up their local deity. And in this
Yeah.
case, it was Bastet.
Mhm.
So Bastet gets a certain level of extra boost of prominence, of fame at this point. But as I say, she did have a role throughout. I mean, her name Bast seems to be connected with a type of ointment. That's what it means.
Mhm.
Ointment has a protective quality, and so this seems to feed into this idea of Bastet as although fierce goddess, a protective one at the same time, just the way ointment is protective too.
She had
Um,
a huge festival as well,
that's
wasn't
right.
it? Later times.
Yeah, that's right. And our best evidence for that comes from Herodotus, writing later on, the Greek writer, who gives us quite a detailed account of what people told him about this when he was saying that about 700,000 people, probably very much inflated number, I'd say, turns up to these festival every year. Children are banned. Everybody goes there and gets massively drunk. And this is a way of celebrating the goddess's festival there in this grand temple that was again also expanded quite heavily when she rose to extra prominence. And so this would have been a big festival, lots of drinking, lots of celebrating, lots of offering to the goddess, so animal offerings. Um, and yeah, lots of drinking. But drinking in general is quite a common aspect of Egyptian ritual and religion.
I
You
was
know,
going to ask you about the beer because it played quite a large part in their daily lives of most ancient Egyptians, didn't it?
yeah, that's right.
What was it generally, if you know that is, what was it generally made for, and what may it have tasted like?
I mean, I'm afraid I'm not too up on how they made it, the ingredients, other than I'm pretty sure. I mean, hops are a more medieval thing, aren't they? So it wouldn't have had that
Yes,
in it.
they came
Um,
generally later. Yeah.
so I mean, yeah. Other than that, I can't really say. I do remember vaguely that the beer was flavored, so that they would give it some. I think put dates in there or honey to sweeten it and give it a bit of extra flavors and probably other ingredients to add to it. I know that experimentally people have tried to reconstruct it, so recreate these ancient recipes. And I know that for a long time people were saying that it had a sort of quite thick, kind of almost soupy, porridgey
Mm.
consistency, and the alcohol percentage would have been quite low, maybe just a few percent.
Hmm.
Um, but it was drank pretty much every day by everybody. People got paid in beer. Even children drank it. And so it was a very big part of their lives, brewed in large quantities. I mean,
Probably safer too if it's been heated up.
yeah, yeah, that's another thing too. Yeah, absolutely. I think also, if I remember rightly, that it was probably more likely that people would have like drank it from these kind of huge vases using straws because it would have been
Hmm.
quite needed filtering, and these straws had filters, if I remember rightly, built in. And so you might have all been known a few people with straws drinking out these same sort of jars. Um, so yeah, it was an important part of your not just your daily life as something you drank. It was also used as a form of payment for people. Um, it was used by the general population too, because of course, the rich, they also drank wine. That was more of a thing associated with the elite. But a beer was something you wanted in your afterlife too. When you see the offering lists of the food and drink that people wanted to take with them into the afterlife, bread and beer are the staples of life. These are the types of things that you would live on. These are the types of things you would
Mm.
offer to even the dead. And beer itself, as I say, in the Bubastis temple, when they had these big drunken celebrations, which weren't just there. These big drunken celebrations were parts of other festivals too in Egypt, but also just parts of when you would go to visit the ancestors, for example, in the cemetery. There was a big festival every year in Luxor, ancient Thebes, in the cemetery there on the west bank of the Nile, where people would drink a lot of beer in the cemetery, and much of this alcohol would actually be offered by the temples to the people, given by the
Mm.
by the priests, so people could drink with their ancestors. The ghosts of the dead were believed to get drunk with you.
Wasn't
Um,
all bad then.
no, and I mean, but as far as well as people having a fun drunken time, the idea here was also that this kind of mental state that changes as the alcohol
Mm.
takes hold was believed to have ritual importance because it was meant to change or blur the lines between reality and this kind of more divine realm. So the idea that you had a more of a connection with the divine or the dead when you entered this kind of slightly drunken state kind of blurred the lines between
Mm.
realms, I suppose you could say, makes you closer to them.
Speaking of rituals and stuff, um, sacred statues played a large part in religious beliefs in ancient Egypt. Can you tell me a little bit more how statues were supposedly activated and worshipped, and how and why were they sometimes deactivated and broken up?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, so statues, yes. So as you say, were very key in all sorts of different aspects of Egyptian belief. Not just in the famous big temples where you have these grand, like, well, these beautifully carved statues from precious materials that the priests would have dealt with. But in the tombs as well, where you have multiple statues of the dead, and these were not just to be pretty. These are beautiful artworks. They were functional, like pretty much all Egyptian art. They had a purpose, and these were used by the gods, used by the dead, to interact with the living. The Egyptians were very, they believed in the idea that you need to that there were invisible forces around them at all
Yeah.
times, But you can't interact with them. You can't touch these forces. You need to give them a vessel,
Yeah.
something to in which that you can then physically deal with them. And so this is where the idea of statues comes in, and they are used by the dead, they are used by the divine, so that they can breathe in the incense, so that they can magically eat or drain the food and drink you bring to them. But the gods couldn't just simply inhabit any old thing. There were rules surrounding this, rules to make the rituals operate. And so you had to make let's say you were picking a statue of a god. You wanted to make it usable by the god. You had to, for normally, put its name on it. Names were extremely important. You had to identify this statue as of this god, and then you had to perform the correct rituals on it to make it active, magically active. And so the most famous among these various rituals is what they call the opening of the mouth ceremony,
Yeah.
when you make certain religious utterances and you touch the mouth of the statue with an adze, a ritual adze, and various other things too. This was just one aspect of reactivating the mouth so it could speak. You touch the eyes so it can see, the ears so it can hear, so etc.
They did that with mummies as well, I think, didn't they?
Exactly, yes. So mummies as well, which are vessels for the dead, places that the dead could go in death and inhabit. And so the same rituals that you perform on a statue of the god, you perform on a mummy to reactivate the body for use magically in the afterlife, by the dead. You do the same thing with a statue of the deceased as well, because mummies and statues in a tomb were very similar in the way that they operated. They were vessels for the dead. The statues were backups in case the mummy was destroyed. And so you activated these things, and not just them as well. If you're in a temple, every image of a god would have the same rituals performed on them too. You activated the artworks in these tombs and in the temples so that they could be magically used. So this is the kind of very practical aspect here. The Egyptians' religion is very practical as well in the way that these rituals were operated. They thought, so okay, we have invisible forces. We can't really touch it. How do I deal with something I can't touch? Well, we make sure we have
making it tangible, really, isn't it? The intangible tangible.
Yes, exactly. So you make something tangible, but of course, you can't just expect it to go anywhere. You need to make it so that you can use this and treat it like a body. The same way that the Egyptians believed each human has different aspects of different spiritual elements within them. This Egyptian concept of the soul is quite complex, in that there's multiple aspects to it. But the body is used as a vessel for these animating forces. So a statue must need this animating force too to use. And so you have this idea then of active statues that are used by the gods, used by the dead, etc. But there comes a point, normally in everything, that things have to change. You need a new statue. You're expanding the temple. You're demolishing part of the temple, and so you might want to use a different statue as the main vessel for this god. Now, it's in some cases, you can imagine that for people who have been to Egypt and seen these grand temples, like Karnak, for example, in Luxor, there's these great spaces, these huge courtyards, lots of space, where you could put statues of prominent individuals normally, but there came points where you have a clean out. And so they kept these often in the spaces still. Sometimes they just simply buried them in the local, in like a pit, still in the sacred space. But sometimes you also wanted to deactivate them because you wanted to maybe replace them with or stop them having this spiritual aspect. Stop them being this aspect of the god that the god can inhabit and just make it another lump of stone again. Turn it back to what it originally was. And in those cases, you would normally break it in certain key positions. For example, the knees, the arms, the neck. And this kind of served to sever the connection between the divine and the statue.
Would it be like the priests that were doing this?
I imagine so. Yes, I'm trying to think if I can think of any specific evidence, but it would have been priests because you would have had to ritually, let's say, decharged it of its energy. So I think only specialists, as again these kind of technicians of Egyptian religion, would have had the specialist knowledge to perform the rituals and the acts of doing it, I suppose.
Yes, there was also another kind of I'm forgetting the name now, like a type of magician that would go around and do the spells in people's houses and.
Yes, lector priests.
That's kind of one. I knew it had something to do with Hannibal Lecter. That was it.
That's right. Yeah.
That's
lector
it.
priests. They don't go around murdering and eating people. They go around reading books. So it's a little different. But yep, lector priests. They were kind of the magicians, the sorcerers of ancient Egypt, who you called on for your magical needs, because people in general seem to have had a general idea of magic, right? So the
Yeah.
average household, the normal family would have had an element of connection with all of this. They would have known the right rituals, let's say, to perform in their daily lives. But sometimes you needed someone with a much more detailed knowledge for something more complex. And this is where you called on your lector priest to come along and perform the correct rituals. And that's why they become the subject of like Egyptian stories as well. You get lector priests often featuring in some of the more magical stories that survive to us. But yeah, there was a very fascinating case recently you might have seen of a researcher studying the statues of the Queen slash King Hatshepsut and the deactivated statues of
Yes, I
hers
did.
that he identified. So that was a fascinating find as well. That these statues were believed to have been smashed out of anger, but in fact he was arguing from the way that they were smashed that these are actually deactivated statues. So carefully damaged on purpose to stop them having this magical aspect.
Yes, because people often forget that there were actual female pharaohs as well, weren't they? Can you say
That's
a little bit about them? I know there weren't many, but they did exist.
absolutely, yeah. We often have very limited information about them, but they did exist. That's absolutely the case. I mean, obviously, Cleopatra, I think, is the one that comes to mind to most people. Probably, she's one of the most famous Egyptian queens to rule. But she, of course, comes very late, the very, very end of, let's say, traditional Egyptian history before the arrival of the Romans. In the more ancient periods, the times that were even ancient to Cleopatra, yes, we also had queens that ruled as kings. I mean, one of the earliest we know of is Sobek Nefru, for example. She was a queen that ruled as king at the end of the 12th dynasty. But we know very little about her. And it seems to have been that at this point, the royal dynasty was coming to an end. There was, seems to have been no successors really to kind of take over. And so we have this female king taking power, but seemingly only for quite a short period of time. A little later on, in the 19th dynasty, at the end of this period again, we have another woman, Tawosret, who had been the wife of King Seti II, and then Queen Regent during the reign of Siptah, who was a child who came to power. And so they needed someone to rule in his place until he got older. And
Hmm.
so the queen took over in this case. And then when Siptah died after just 6 years as king, Tawosret reigned on her own as king. But again, it doesn't seem to have lasted very long, and the period that ends there is very much mired in, and it's very murky, mired in mystery. We don't really know quite what the situation was at the end of her reign. But then after her, we get a new dynasty in charge. But she might have been, I think, related to Ramesses II potentially. I guess maybe a granddaughter or something. I can't remember off the top of my head. So there might be a connection there with the family, but after that, we get a new line. So again, we have two examples there of queens coming to power at the end of a dynasty. But probably the most famous and significant one is Hatshepsut. She is was a queen who became king in the 18th dynasty at a powerful position. So not at the end of a dynasty when a dynasty is kind of coming to its end, but at a time when Egypt was quite powerful. Um, and this is a quite common thing, not common, but quite a, how can I say, in the 18th dynasty, royal women were very powerful. They had a very important role to play in kingship as the female equivalent of royal power. We have earlier than Hatshepsut in that same dynasty, a queen seemingly commanding the army when the king was too young, so playing a prominent military role. And these great royal wives were very prominent generally at this point. So the fact that Hatshepsut came to power isn't too unusual in the sort of 18th dynasty context where we see a lot of powerful women.
Hmm. She had a pretty impressive temple as well.
That's right, yes. So basically, Hatshepsut is best known, I suppose, today because of this temple at Deir el-Bahri, which is in Luxor on the west bank of the Nile. It's her mortuary temple, built on multiple levels with lots of beautiful columns, and preserves some of the major events from her reign inside, including this very famous trading mission to this mysterious land of Punt,
Oh, yeah.
which was an Egyptian source of incense.
Hmm.
which the gods loved. The gods loved incense, and Punt
Mm.
was the source of the best incense possible. And so, by showing on her walls this mission she dispatched to the land of Punt,
Hmm.
she was emphasizing her piety, her role that she played for the gods, because she brought this very special incense back. Um, and there was also military campaigns under Hatshepsut as well. Nubia, for example, as well as having a diplomatic, trading important role, she was also sending out missions to keep control of Egypt's growing empire at this point. Um, and she's fascinating for other reasons too. I mean,
Connected with Hathor, wasn't she?
most queens are in general.
Okay.
So Hathor has a very important role to play in queenship,
Okay.
and the role of kind of magic and motherhood and all of this that comes along with Hathor, and the roles that the queens played as a sort of manifestation of these elements in the cosmos, and the female role of the female element of kingship, I should say. Um, but famously, there was. If you look at some of the older history books, you can see many of these kind of misinterpretations, I suppose, of the evidence that you get. If you look at Victorian uh, history books that talk about Hatshepsut, she's always presented as this kind of evil stepmother character who was illegally ruling
Mhm.
in place of who should have been the real king, which was
Yeah.
Tutmosis III, who was a
Yeah.
child.
Yeah.
Um,
Indeed. Yeah.
and so you get this whole story being built up around this kind of evil queen and the rightful king, and this very dramatic story of, and you see these kind of Victorian era ideas influencing the history here, because the idea that to the Victorian writers that a woman couldn't have got this
Yeah.
position without being evil, or mistreating the true king and all these types of things. So very much based around fairy tales almost. The wicked stepmother idea. Um, and it's basically the evidence that we have today really does not show this at all. You
No.
know, there's no evidence at all that she was, hated in her time. There's no evidence at all that she, schemed to take power. The courtiers that served her seem to have been quite happy, serving her.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, again, as I say, it links, I think, more with this idea of powerful women at this point in the 18th dynasty, having a very, you know, these women that played a prominent role. So one becoming a king isn't so unusual. I would imagine it was probably going to happen. And Tutmosis, the king, who she was meant to be originally regent for, he was given, as he got older, control of the army that seemed to have had a campaign in Gaza at this point. So if you're fearful that this
Yep.
person wants to take back the throne, you aren't going to give him control of the army. Um,
No.
so yeah, they seem to have ruled quite equally with each other. There's images of them both being equal in size, for example, in art. He had a role to play in the Temple of Amun. He controlled the army, the Tutmosis III, I mean. And she seems to have died a natural death. There was always, again, these people inventing these stories that maybe she was murdered by Tutmosis III, the rightful king, and all these things. But if the body that we've identified as Hatshepsut is truly her, there's no signs of foul play, no signs of murder. It seems she had cancer, and she
Mhm.
probably died of natural causes, or the cancer killed her at some point.
I
And
know
then
she's
Tutmosis
depicted
came to power.
sometimes with a beard, isn't it? I think was that just to sort of shore up her power, perhaps.
I think these things, again, remember the power of Egyptian art and the importance of traditionalism in artwork.
Okay. Yep.
And so these you shouldn't see this in terms, perhaps. I mean, this is just an interpretation. There are lots of arguments around all of this, of course. But one way of looking at it is simply these are the symbols of kingship.
Yep.
And so, if you want to be shown as a king, this is how you're shown in art,
Yeah.
and to keep that marked, to keep things in
Yeah.
order. And so, you can interpret it in different ways, but I think the most simple answer is simply these are the symbols of kingship, and so that's how she's shown.
Another easy question for you.
Oh, good.
Do you think that Christianity was influenced or inspired in any way by such ideas as Ptah's creation myth, Akhenaten's monotheism, or the strict codes for the scribes in any way?
Yes, that is a bit of a big one. Yeah, so let's try and answer that quickly, shall we?
Yeah, go for it.
In just a few paragraphs or
Yeah.
sentences. No. Was there influence? Of course, when you're talking about Christianity, we're also talking about Judaism here,
Mm.
because of the Old Testament, New Testament. And so there would have been different phases of influence depending on the period. Um, but I mean, there are certainly areas where you can see there are influences. I mean, I think one of the most popularly known one is this idea of the Madonna and Child, probably being influenced by images of Isis and Horus, which were very
Hmm.
common in the ancient world, and particularly during the Hellenistic period, when you have these ideas spreading across the world, the Hellenistic world, I should say. So, like ideas of Isis temples, the Isis cults popping up around what had been Hellenized. So, this idea of the image of the mother with the child seemingly did feed into images of Mary and Jesus.
Hmm.
So you can see an influence there with art. Other aspects, I think it's more a case of similar ideas being spread across that region, across the Near East, North Africa, the Middle East,
Yeah.
kind of being a sort of ideas spreading through traders and people moving and so forth. So I wouldn't see it as a direct influence, more a sort of like same ideas popping up in different forms as they've
Mm.
spread. Um, so, for example, Akhenaten is a complex one here.
Yeah.
So, for again listeners who maybe don't know Akhenaten, he is an Egyptian king who upturned religion, who is famously, or popularly, I should say, is associated with being the first monotheist.
Hmm.
He traditionally, when you read about him, he banned all the gods and he worshipped the god Aten, which is the sun disk,
Hmm.
and and so people see him as a monotheist. It's a bit more complex than that. I think these days people might not see him that way anymore. So if you no longer see him as a monotheist, the idea of his ideas spreading and influencing other cultures into monotheism doesn't really work. I mean, I think the best way of looking at him these days is not that he, you know, removed or denied the existence of other gods and just had one single god. I think it's more that he denied the power, or chose not to worship anymore the other gods.
Yeah. It
So
was his own choice for himself more than that of the people and his new capital. I think
yeah,
that's what I get out of it anyway.
yeah, that exactly it. Yeah, so the idea that I think he would have acknowledged that there are other gods existing, he just doesn't want to worship them anymore, and directs the state religion towards his god.
Mm.
This Aten, and in which itself might have been more of a trinity, or in that you have the Aten, Nefertiti, and Akhenaten as seemingly working together as a new family grouping, which is quite traditional if you look at traditional families of Egyptian gods, which are always
Hmm.
triads. Um, and so you see the same thing there. He's manipulating tradition rather than, I think, creating a new. You see a lot of changes, but he's still working within certain bounds of
Mm.
March, for example. I mean, it's complex because I think everybody has their own opinions of Akhenaten, and it again changes about when you're reading about him. There used to be this idea, I think, in the 60s, of him being a bit of a hippie, believing only in peace and love, and retreating to his city to just focus on religion. But of
Hmm.
course, then you reinterpret this a bit later on, and he sent military campaigns. So he was sending armies out to fight.
Mm.
He was always surrounded by a royal bodyguard, a heavily armed group of men who followed him everywhere. So he wasn't exactly into peace, I think. People talk about him neglecting the empire because he's so focused on his religion, but you can interpret that as maybe he was like waiting and seeing, like being strategic to see what was like developing across the empire
Mm.
rather than acting immediately. So there's different ways of looking at him. And so, as I say now, although in the old days, let's say Victorian era, he was more seen as this monotheist, I think now it's more that he's someone who, let's say, you could say, preferred the worship of the Aten. And
Yeah,
we know
because
this
his
now.
father was heading in that direction anyway, wasn't he?
That's right, yeah. You start seeing the rise of Atenism under Amenhotep III, his father, and there's
Hmm.
elements of it even before that. The growing changes in the sun cult you can chart across this period, the kind of adaptations that are going on across that. And he's kind of the ultimate end result of this changing attitudes towards the sun cult.
Mm.
But what you see is from new archaeological investigations at Amarna, so the city that he founded and moved everybody to, or the court I should say, to, the average people in the city still wore amulets of traditional gods,
Yes.
for example. So
Hmm.
he wasn't, even in, and this wasn't something that could be hidden. There's so many of these around that, so it's not like he had troops going around snatching amulets off people and banning the traditional cults.
No, I think that's just tabloid. I think that seems to be, it's just a little hook to get people involved, thinking that he was some massive heretic going around destroying everybody else and all
Yes.
the other gods, and he was hated by everybody. But really, most people just carried on in the same way. But he did create a new capital, albeit short lived.
Sure, sure. But founding new capitals wasn't unusual for kings who wanted to start a new phase. Ramesses II, Ramesses
Hmm.
II, he started a new capital. Amenemhat I, at the beginning of the 12th dynasty, founded a new capital. And so it wasn't that in itself is not a heretical or revolutionary
No.
movement. Only a symbol of a king who has thoughts about wanting to start something anew, but it's not really that extreme. I mean, you find it across the Near East as well, with other kings doing similar things.
Hmm.
So that in itself was unusual. And he changed the art, sure, he changed religion. To me, I mean, personally, his real problem was with Amun, the god Amun, so the Amun Ra, the famous king of the gods, the big king of the New Kingdom. He's a goddess of hiddenness. I'm sorry, a god of hiddenness, I should say, a
Hmm.
god of the dark, the kind of the mysteries
Yeah.
that go beyond our kind of creation. And now, if you imagine that your focus is on a god of light, the sun disk, well, a god of hiddenness and dark would be the opposite of that, and something you just don't want. And so, I kind of see his anger directed at that god simply because it represented everything that his god was supposed to be the opposite of. That he represented a god of light, and this was a god of darkness, a god of hiddenness, and so he really shut down all of that. But everything else seems to have just almost carried on as normal. Almost.
Hmm.
The problem is the
Possibly
lack
the
of evidence.
power of the priests as well. He didn't seem to be too keen on.
Again, I'm not sure. I mean, I see that personally. Again, my own interpretation of this is that
Okay.
the priesthood wasn't so much the problem for him, though. I think it's more that what the god the priests were worshipping. So there's all these
Okay.
interpretations about like the power of the Amun priesthood, etc. But I mean, the kings had the power to really put people in these positions. Like if the king wanted, I'm sure he could have just taken away some of these, power himself. He didn't need to go to this extreme to influence the Amun priesthood. He could have put a royal son in one of the key positions. He could have, spread the income and the loot that he would take from foreign campaigns out differently. He could reduce the influence in different ways. To me, I see this as a personal attack on the god Amun, and
Okay.
the priesthood are kind of collateral damage in his attack on this particular god, just because it represents the opposite of what he believes. But you think of like other gods. As I said, the amulets are one sign of this that the
Yeah.
ordinary people are wearing. But just like down the river from his new capital at Amarna, you have the major center of the god Thoth at Hermopolis.
Yes.
And this is a major god, important god
Hmm.
in the pantheon, major cult center. There's no real evidence of any real attacking of any of that god's images just down the river. So he
Hmm.
seems to have completely left Thoth alone. He didn't really care for damaging this god's images. I mean, there's also some indications that Osiris was still happening around the amount of time as well, and so the afterlife connected with him.
Well, that's right. And even if he wanted, his reach would not really have got to every area of Egypt anyway, would it? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
it,
It's if you want to see it as him failing to spread his ideas, that's one of the things. He kept
hmm.
himself too small scale, too much to the court, to the loyal followers. There is some evidence of it being in Memphis and in Luxor. We have like dedications to the Atenas for his temples and stuff and
Mhm.
priests. But as far as its penetration beyond these kind of major centers, he only had, let's say, he reigned for 17 years.
Yeah.
And no, the real kind of pushes for, let's say, the more radical aspects came in, let's say, after year 5. And so there's not long really to get this movement going.
No, very short period of time.
But I realize I completely digressed from the whole question you actually asked.
Well, I was going to tap you up a little bit about Ptah as well and his creation because of the actual spoken word. Just
Yeah.
seem to have similarities going on with Christianity. But do you think that common folk believed in an afterlife as well? And if so, what do you imagine it may have looked like? We're sort of aware of what the pharaohs and nobility
Hmm.
imagined in a perfect afterlife, but have you any ideas of what the common folk expected?
I think
That's
this is.
another easy question.
Yeah. I mean, Yeah, it's. I think it's an area that we are slowly going to be learning more about these days, given that archaeologists are, more interested these days in learning more about the average people.
Yeah.
Um, and you think of archaeology in the past, it was very much focused on grand discoveries, temples,
Hmm.
tombs of the rich, kings. And as archaeology has changed over the decades, it's now more focused on normal people. The problem here is that in Egypt, in particular, we have certain the country, the way the geography is of the country is working against us
Yes.
because people live along the Nile. It's surrounded by desert, and so the areas where people lived, their daily lives, their villages, their towns, it's all underneath what are modern cities, towns, villages, and so it's hard to get at evidence from daily life
Mm.
because of this reason. You look at the major finds we have, the information we have comes from cemeteries out in the desert,
Hmm.
temples that were built out of stone so that have survived the centuries. But areas where the normal people lived, there's limited information archaeologically because it's inaccessible, or they've been destroyed over the years because these would have been wood brick and so forth. So
Hmm.
again, limits their information, and
Yeah.
most people were illiterate. Literacy was
Yeah.
very tiny number. Let's say 3, 4, 5% of the population, and so these people weren't writing anything down. We don't have information about what they were thinking, and as you say, much of what we have is written by the elite, the kings. It's from their tombs. It's from their temples. So what does that mean? But when we do find cemeteries connected with ordinary people, and again, this is something that people are more investigating more and more these days, you find typically, let's say the body was wrapped in a mat, a reed mat. Maybe there's a few objects placed in the simple pit grave.
Hmm.
Maybe a pot, maybe a personal item. What does that show? Well, it shows that burying the dead was important. The fact that they have objects with them suggests that maybe they felt that they could use these things in the afterlife. The idea that you could take it with you, which was a very big part of Egyptian elite religion, at least. And
Yes.
so you can perhaps see a continuation here of the idea of an afterlife, but then there are problems, right? Because the rich spent so much of their resources on building
Hmm.
elaborate tombs, and the tombs
Hmm.
are machines to help you achieve your afterlife and keep it going. You need a mummy. You need these tomb inscriptions. You need people
Mm.
offering to you. How did they get around this if you were an ordinary person without these resources? I suppose if you were lucky, the natural sand and the heat would have naturally mummified your body.
Hmm.
But in many cases, this doesn't happen. Um, so if you don't have a body, how does your body survive? You don't have the income to have statues, and the statues are normally the rich's backup for your soul. And if you
Yeah.
didn't have your body and you didn't have the statues, and your name was lost to the elite, your soul had a second death. It vanishes
Yeah.
from existence. It loses its afterlife.
Hmm.
So if you're an ordinary person, you can't have really had that belief because nobody would have made it. Um, so there has to be a sort of adaptation here for what ordinary people would have thought. And of course, this is all me speculating.
Hmm.
I mean, often, for example, people talk about the Book of the Dead as being important. This is a New Kingdom thing where you need these right rituals to guide you through the afterlife realm to reach judgment. And so, if you think that you're buried without a Book of the Dead, then you think you're kind of like screwed from the beginning. You're going to get lost in the afterlife and not even make it to judgment.
You'd have to need
Um,
quite a lot of intuition, I think.
say again?
Have to need quite a bit of intuition, I think, to
Yes, that's
imagine
right.
all of that.
I mean, this is a dangerous place. Now, one way around this is perhaps that maybe these cemeteries had let's say, a collective Book of the Dead. Maybe there was a priest in the town, which normally a priest or a scribe in the town, which you would normally have, and perhaps the Book of the Dead was applicable to all the dead in the local cemetery,
Yeah.
magically. So that's
Hmm.
maybe one way around this problem. You might maybe a Book of the Dead is more, and it probably is the case, more of a luxury item. Instead of
Yes.
sharing one, you have it to yourself, and so it's used by you and your family. It's the private one because you're elite and you can afford it. So maybe poorer people had a communal one for the town. A communal selection of spells that were used that the rich had inscribed on their walls, but poorer
By the
people.
lector priests again, perhaps.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe the local
Yeah.
elect priests perform the rituals generally for the population. Doesn't help you with the body preservation element, which is kind of fundamental
No.
if you're rich, but it's kind of all we can really say, I suppose. To me, it looks like they did believe in an afterlife. Most people do, to be honest, so it would be unusual
Yes.
for them not to. Um, but I reckon potentially that how the rules of it operated might have been slightly different. But then again, as I say, the difference could just be simply the difference between having a mansion and a luxury selection of cars and all the best technology versus what average people have in their homes. So the idea that a tomb is more of a luxury thing, a mummification thing is more of a luxury thing, and so there are more basic versions available or equivalents available for people who didn't have the same resources.
Well, they were very practical people, weren't they? But
Yeah.
the tangible shell still mattered. The body did actually matter,
Hmm. Yeah.
regardless.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, there is. I mean, for example, Deir el Medina, the workmen's village of the people who dug and decorated the Valley of the Kings. So these were not the most elite. They were well off. They were good in a good position in society, a very privileged position. But if we can look at their houses, which do survive, we know that, for example, they had ancestor busts in their houses.
Yes.
So these they're like little torsos almost, or kind of the upper body with a head, and they don't have names on them because they seem to represent the totality of your ancestors. They're a way of communicating with the ancestors in the afterlife to ask them for help because the dead have a special connection with the divine.
Mhm.
And so this seems to have been a common thing at Deir el Medina. And if we can then project that to other village life,
Mm.
maybe you could perhaps imagine that other people had these similar, maybe simpler versions of these busts
Mm.
that would allow them to communicate with the dead.
A bit like
And
how we have with photographs today, really.
guess so, except if you believe that talking to the photograph meant that your dead relative could then go and talk to other ghosts and the dead to make your life better. Um, and so it's a way of communicating. And so if you imagine that this was a normal thing, then they clearly did believe that these people were in the afterlife. They made it.
Yes.
They navigated the problems that were on the journey to eternal life. Um, so yeah, but beyond that,
Speaking of things eternal,
Mhm.
I'm going to have to ask this question because I'm going to get moaned at if I don't. Approximately how old is the Sphinx, and who or what does it represent?
Okay, well, Sphinx, I mean, is
The Sphinx.
the great the Great Sphinx at Giza.
The Great Sphinx of Giza. Yep.
So it's 4,500 years old. It's 2,500 BC. Um, we associate it with the pyramid complex of King Khafre, who was a fourth dynasty king of the Old Kingdom, and it seems to be a representation of the god they call Horem Akhet, Horus in the horizon.
Okay.
And so this is a form of Horus who represents kingship, but as a form of the sun as well. So the kind of Horus connected with the sun god. And it seems to have been a sort of protector of the necropolis, but associated also with the sun because it's stirring towards the east to the rising sun, which is the direction of resurrection. We also have sphinxes in like funerary texts as protectors as well. So there's a sort of protective element of the necropolis, but also a resurrection element and a connection with the king and through Horus and the sun god. So there's some multiple layered meaning here. But importantly, this is generally what we find from the New Kingdom phase. So we have references to the Sphinx in the New Kingdom, particularly the dream stele of King Thutmosis IV, where he talks about the Sphinx appearing to him in his dreams. Now, as we've talked about before, things change over the years. We don't know specifically what the Egyptians of the Old Kingdom would have seen in it, but certainly in the New Kingdom, it had these connections with kingship and the sun god.
Well, it certainly looks quite, lion-like from a distance, doesn't it? So you think you can't want for a better protector, really, of the area
Yeah, kind of
than
the
a
sort of
lion. I mean, considering the further back you go back into the Old Kingdom and just a bit before that, lions weren't that uncommon. I don't think in Egypt. The further back we go,
no. Particularly, I mean, kings would go hunting in that area around Giza. This was for a long period. This was more, savanna-like, full of dangerous animals, even that far north. And so, yeah, there were areas and hunting grounds. Kings would go hunting lions, particularly at various points in the Levant. This was something where kings showed their power and strength. Although in reality, they were probably having these poor animals put into enclosures where the kings were completely safe, and then the
yeah.
kings would shoot at them from safety with their arrows. So it's
Very likely. Do
yeah,
you
yeah.
think that there's any more? There will be any more vaults found within the pyramids or around the Sphinx itself, the Great Sphinx?
Um, in terms of vaults, you mean potential burial places and tombs and things? I
Yeah,
mean,
I think recently there's been something about the one of the, I think possibly the Great Pyramid, about another area supposedly found or known to be in existence.
they're often finding cavities. Let's say,
Okay.
these aren't official spaces. Like they aren't rooms meant to be used, but they're often left over as part of the construction process. So I'm talking about the Great Pyramid there in
Yeah.
particular.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, people have this idea of the Great Pyramid as being this kind of symbol of perfection. But it's really not when you start looking at it. There are areas where you can see into the fabric of the construction of the pyramid. I mean, unfortunately, the leftovers from, I think, dynamites used by Victorians to kind of like break into the pyramid in various places. And it kind of, I mean, the only positive offshoot of that, destruction of this monument in places is that you can see inside it a little bit more. And so you see that these outer layers are really good, but the inside is a bit rougher. That
Yeah.
there are stones aren't as perfect, that they're a bit more uneven. There's sand filling spots and things like this, and so when they do these kind of studies, which kind of like penetrate through the pyramid. I mean, the most recent one, and maybe you're thinking of, is perhaps these kind of ones where they use what is it, like cosmic radiation almost. That
Hmm.
where they put receptors on the ground and they pick up the radiation that's passing through the pyramid, and it kind of shows up where there are cavities.
Hmm.
And the fact that there are spaces that have different densities isn't really surprising because they probably did cut corners at various points to make it easier to construct. Which is why all these numbers that you ever get about how many blocks are in there or how many years it took to make are probably off because you don't know how rough parts of it are potentially on the inside.
Right.
Um, and so some of these spaces that show up might just simply be sand-filled cavities. Um, there are other spots. I think if I'm remembering correctly, it looked like there was a sort of space above the Grand Gallery in some of these kind of, let's say, X-ray-like images.
Mm.
But again, it could just be part of the construction method to try and maybe in the Egyptians' minds, because again, they were kind of generally kind of doing this for the first time often, and with these experiments of building at that size or trying to put chambers in different locations. It may have been a way to deflect some of the weight from above.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it might not be again an official chamber, but maybe spaces that they felt were necessary.
Storage area.
Not even thinking in terms of storage areas. I'm thinking just in terms of space
Mm.
like that would deflect weight. So
Hmm.
the architectural purposes. I know that some people, like to believe there might be extra chambers behind those doors or slabs they've found in the little shafts that lead up from the Queen's chamber, but they're probably symbolic. Uh,
Okay.
so I don't know if anybody should really get their hopes up of anything being behind it.
Would it be
Um,
right to say that most of the temples that we see today in Egypt date from the late kingdom? Um, and what do we mean by the late kingdom itself?
so I think you mean the late period. I think in
The
this,
late period. Sorry, yes,
yeah,
the late
yeah. So
period.
I mean, again, for the listeners who don't know the way that works, I mean, in Egypt, you have this is a modern thing where Egyptologists refer to kingdoms and intermediate periods. So, kingdoms are normally periods when there's a one king controlling the whole territory and Egypt is unified. Intermediate periods are times when Egypt breaks apart and has
Hmm.
multiple competing, let's say, kings or rulers. So, we have the Old Kingdom is one of these stable periods, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom are these stable periods. For some reason, the final period of stability is called the Late Period, not the Late Kingdom. I'm not quite sure why they did that, but
Well, it got
the,
me anyway.
yeah. It should it's a roughly stable period,
Yeah.
except for the Persian era in the middle. Sorry, just take a swig of water.
Hmm.
Um, and so yes, we have a lot of the temples surviving from that period because this was a time of great construction again when the there was a bit more stability going on, and so that leads to people doing building projects. And so it was a time when they were demolishing parts of the, let's say, the older temples that are already thousands, a couple of thousand years old by this time in some cases, um, and replacing them with new constructions. So they're built of stone, large stones. They survive the years. They survive down through the decades, particularly ones in the south. The ones in the north tend to not survive as well because there's not much quality stone. to
Hmm.
be quarried in the delta, and so many of those stones from those temples have been reused over the years as basically quarries. Um, so a lot of these temples do survive from that time, and also the time after that, the Ptolemaic period, which is when you have these kind of Greek Macedonian successors of Alexander ruling over Egypt,
Yeah.
and they did a lot of construction too. So a lot of the temples also survive from their period of time. So when when you go visiting many of the temples in Egypt, some of the best preserved ones date from this late period and under the Ptolemaic dynasty.
Mm. That was if they
Uh,
were sort of fortifying their sort of rights, really, wasn't it? They were, making themselves to be Egyptians.
yeah, I mean, it's a symbol of them behaving like true Egyptian kings. I mean, true Egyptian kings of this time were supposed to construct things for the gods, offer to the gods, be pious with the gods, and so yeah, it's a symbol of them behaving according to the rules of kingship.
Mm. Given the rise of modern day paganisms, do you think there is anything to be gained spiritually, artistically, or even just as an appreciation of the ancient Egyptian gods in the modern world?
I mean, yes. I mean, I think there's always something to be learned from all religious beliefs, all cultures, and the way they look at the world, try to explain the world. Whether a person believes it or not, these are things are fascinating as an insight into the way people have looked at the universe and the world around them and tried to explain it, understand it. And I think you know of trying to answer the big questions of the universe. So I
Mhm.
think looking at any world culture and its religion is very valuable. And of course, yeah, if you're a modern day pagan, then yes, it's you can learn a lot. You can gain a lot, I think, from people who had thousands of years, of looking at the
Mm.
world around them and developing their religion and developing their way of understanding the world. Looking at
Yes, they
ancient
certainly
cultures.
refined their beliefs to an incredible amount, didn't they?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think if I'm thinking in terms of what would be a major takeaway, let's put it that way, from if you wanted something that is important, I think that comes from Egyptian spirituality, Egyptian religion and belief. I think Mart that we discussed earlier is probably the key thing. That is the kind of real, I think, fundamental aspect of everything that Egyptian belief is based on. So this idea that your life should be one of balance.
Balance. Yeah.
um, the world is in a constant state of flux. The order of chaos, the order of too much order is all around you, and this feeds into Egyptian. We haven't talked about this, but Egyptian wisdom texts. The Egyptians produced wisdom texts that were not only aimed at the court, but probably penetrated deeper as well into society through being spread around by scribes and maybe even read aloud. This idea that you get from wisdom text too is that Mart is part of this philosophy that I think there's one, I can't remember obviously word for word, but in the maxims of Tahotep there's the idea that generally you shouldn't work too hard. Work, do a good job, but don't obsess over it. Don't make your entire life about work. Try and enjoy yourself too. At the same
Yeah.
time, don't dedicate your entire life to partying. Don't get
No.
drunk all the time. Don't spend all your life partying because then you won't achieve anything. And so it's again, both are equally chaotic in their own way. They're not a balanced life. They're not a life of mart. Do what you
Mm.
need enough to succeed, but then be happy. Enjoy a few drinks, but you don't need to go overboard. Just be happy with it. As
Yeah.
long as you're having a life that's virtuous and follows the rules of mart, you don't need to you might not get rich and famous. They say this in these wisdom texts. Wisdom and living a good life according to Mart
Mm.
is reward enough. And it might not bring you treasure. It might not bring you
No.
a great temple or whatever to you, but you will have lived a good life. And so balance is key to all of this. And once you start understanding Mart and you look at how it impacts every aspect of religion and the way that the Egyptians operated in their world, you can see it's this key to kind of approaching it from the start. So I guess if anybody, let's say you're talking about modern day paganism, if a modern day pagan wanted to understand Egyptian belief, you've got to start with Mart
Yeah.
and work
It's a
from
good
there.
foundation.
Yeah, exactly. The foundation. That's right.
What do you think is the lasting legacy of ancient Egypt upon the world's imagination today?
Hmm.
Because it's certainly got one, hasn't it? And it's massive. I appreciate that, but
Yeah,
just a
it's
personal view.
a personal view. I mean, the impact they've had. different ways of looking at it, I suppose. I mean, the first place I go to in my mind, because I like movies and things, is the impact it's had on things like films.
Yeah.
Documentaries. I mean, Egypt is still around us, and we talked about this a bit earlier. But Egypt is still around us in ways that we don't even quite, I think, acknowledge probably consciously often. The little Egyptian's bit of decoration that's found in some local restaurant that because some restaurateur wanted the bit of decoration there. That movie that mentions the Egyptian Book of the Dead as a passing comment in a horror film or something. The Egyptians' culture is still with us in these kind of ways, subtle ways that we all kind of recognize. And I think that's fascinating, as I said earlier, that a culture that's not been around for a couple of thousand years now in its traditional form, in the ancient Egyptian kind of traditional religion, those things are still with us. So they have there's a quality that lasts with them, something that still grips us on a fundamental level. Something about the art that we find beautiful, that they found beautiful too. That bridges this gap of time between us.
Yeah, and the
Uh,
mystery, the Arthur Conan Doyle and his mummy tale and stuff like that. I mean, that's still being lauded today, isn't it? There's so many offshoots of that alone, but definitely the art and the architecture,
yeah,
decoration, it's still absolutely everywhere.
Yeah, I think it works on a level that maybe we don't quite understand. That it kind of artistically it speaks to us. It speaks to the pyramids grip us with just not just their majesty and size and history, but just the look of them. The kind of something about these huge triangular mountains out there in the desert grips us and
You
stays in the
just can't
imagination.
ignore them, can you? Really?
Exactly. Something about the art style, the colors that spring from that sticks with you. And so through all of this and the way it lasts, it becomes part of all of us. Subconsciously, some more of us, maybe consciously, people who study ancient Egypt or read about it. But as I say, it's there within everybody to some degree, and I think that is something quite important that speaks about something what the ancient Egyptians created all those thousands of years
Yeah,
ago.
it's very profound, I think, the
Yeah,
legacy.
I think so.
And lastly, I'd like you to give a plug for any books you've written about ancient Egypt and mention any current projects that you are now involved in.
Well, I'd say, I suppose, if listeners have enjoyed me, talking about the subject, they might be interested in. I wrote two books about Egyptian mythology. One is called Egyptian Mythology: A Traveler's Guide from Aswan to Alexandria, and the other one is The Egyptian Myths: A Guide to the Ancient Gods and Legends.
Which I
Um,
enjoyed immensely. Just want to add that one in there.
Say again.
Which I enjoyed immensely. Yeah,
Thank you very much.
okay.
That's very, very kind of you. I've also written about Tutankhamun's life. I wrote a more kind of a very recent book on him. I think it was published in 2022. So bringing together a lot of what we know obviously the century since the discovery of his tomb, and that's called the story of Tutankhamun. But if you give me a chance to plug a very different project,
By all
uh,
means.
my latest book came out this year and it's called Cryptic: From Voynich to the Angel Diaries, the story of the world's mysterious manuscripts. And so it's a very different topic from my previous books. This one is about mysterious manuscripts from Europe of the Middle Ages and early modern period, and trying to understand why people wrote or created these mysterious manuscripts. And they come in different types. So a lot of them are enciphered or encoded. I talk about alchemy, because I have an example of an alchemist and the mysterious manuscript and book he created. I talk about demonic magic and angel magic with John Dee and the abbot Tritemius, the German monk who created this method of hiding messages in plain sight. So it's a lot of different manuscripts, and they have a mysterious quality to them. But my main interest with these was to figure out a bit about the lives of the people who made them, to talk
Mm-hmm.
about what their lives are like, what events were going on in their lives and surrounding them in the kind of government or religious world that might have led to these individuals to produce these manuscripts that we now regard as very mysterious. Why did they encipher this? Why did he write this book? Why did John Dee want to
Yeah,
contact
he's
angels?
a fascinating character from history.
Exactly. I'm sure we could have another entire podcast just
We certainly
on these
could, yeah.
topics and just on John Dee even. But I wanted to explore the lives of these people and find out a bit more about these manuscripts. So that was my most recent project, and that was produced. That was released this year.
I look forward to reading it, and thank you for exploring ancient Egypt for me. And
My pleasure.
it was a fabulous chat. I'm really enjoyed it, and
Me too.
I wish you every success in your future projects, my friend.
Thank you very much. And it was really great to be here and really great to chat with you. So thanks again for having me on the show.
Nice one, Gary. Thanks a lot.